What if the most powerful response to disrespect isn't loud? What if it isn't dramatic or perfectly timed or wrapped in a speech that leaves the room stunned? Most of the time, the strongest response is silence, not the silence of fear or confusion, but the silence that comes from control. When someone disrespects you, your body reacts before your mind can catch up. Your chest tightens, your thoughts race. There's an immediate pull to defend yourself, to explain, to prove your worth in real time. That impulse is human. It's automatic. But Stoicism was never about acting on impulse. It was about choosing how you respond when emotion is begging to take over. Here's what most people are never taught. Reacting is optional. Epictetus understood this long before modern life made disrespect constant, public, and amplified. He taught that it isn't the event itself that disturbs us, but the judgment we attach to it. That sounds calm and reasonable until someone talks over you, dismisses you, or treats you like you don't matter. In that moment, philosophy feels far away. All you want is to respond, and that's where most people give away their power. Not because they're weak, but because they don't know how to pause. They don't know how to step out of an emotional situation someone else is trying to pull them into. Disrespect is rarely random. Often it's a test. Someone makes a comment, pushes a boundary, minimizes you in front of others. Sometimes they aren't trying to hurt you. They're checking how much access they have to you. They're watching to see if you'll react, if you'll explain yourself, if you'll chase their approval, or try to restore fairness in the moment. And the second you do, the dynamic shifts. You've entered their frame. You're now playing on their terms. Stoicism doesn't teach passivity. It doesn't tell you to pretend nothing happened or to let people walk all over you. It teaches something far more difficult and far more effective: restraint. The understanding that real power isn't in what you say, but in what you stop giving. Your attention, your energy, your emotional availability. The Stoics believed your attention is your life. Every argument you enter, every explanation you offer to someone who disrespects you costs you clarity and peace you don't get back. Most people think freedom means being able to speak freely, react freely, express freely. Stoicism teaches the opposite. Freedom comes from knowing when not to respond. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly disrespected, this matters. Because there are two versions of you in those moments. One reacts quickly, tries to fix the situation, tries to regain control by force. The other pauses. The other refuses to be pulled into chaos. The other understands that silence, when chosen, deliberately removes oxygen from situations that survive on your reaction. Anger gives people something to push against. Silence leaves them alone with themselves. When there's no argument, they don't feel powerful. When there's no explanation, there's nothing to twist. When there's no reaction, they're left facing their own behavior without distraction. That silence becomes a mirror, and mirrors are uncomfortable because they don't lie. But this only works when your silence is real, not a tactic, not avoidance, a boundary backed by self-control. Your time is not public property. Your energy is not unlimited. Your peace is not negotiable. Access is earned, and disrespect is the fastest way to lose it. This is the Stoic path, not emotional revenge, but emotional sovereignty. And it begins with the first move, the one most people avoid, because it feels like letting go when in reality, it's the first time you take your power back. Because the first form of silence isn't what you don't say, it's what you stop giving. There comes a quiet moment when you realize the most powerful thing you can do isn't to raise your voice or explain yourself one more time. It's to stop showing up. Not out of anger, not to make a point, not to punish anyone, but because something inside you finally settles. You understand that your energy is not a public service. When someone repeatedly disrespects you, they aren't just crossing a boundary. They're relying on your presence to keep doing it. They assume you'll stay, that your patience will stretch, that your emotional labor will always be available. Your willingness to remain becomes permission. That's why withdrawal, complete quiet, and unannounced is so powerful. This is the first silent move, removing access without explanation. Epictetus believed true strength isn't found in controlling others, but in mastering yourself. When you pull away calmly without drama, you shift the entire emotional dynamic. You aren't being passive. You aren't sulking. You're choosing restraint over reaction. Most people live inside patterns. They expect arguments, justifications, emotional reactions, because those things give them leverage. But when you disappear from the pattern, the silence grows heavy. There's no one left to perform for, no one to manipulate, no one to blame. And that's when discomfort begins. It isn't your confrontation that shakes them, it's your absence. By walking away without explanation, you're remembered differently, not as angry, not as broken, but as someone who had the strength to say nothing and still be heard. Over time, that silence echoes louder than any final conversation ever could. While they expected you to argue, you vanished. While they assumed you'd return, you didn't. And in that quiet space, something shifts. But withdrawal is only the beginning. Walking away creates space, and what you do with that space determines everything that follows. Because once you remove yourself from what drains you, a deeper transformation starts. One that happens privately, one that doesn't need witnesses. When you create distance, something subtle begins to happen. The noise fades. The urgency dissolves. The emotional static that once demanded your attention goes quiet. For the first time in a long while, there is space. Space that used to be filled with reacting, explaining, and managing other people's expectations. That space no longer belongs to the past. It belongs to you. This is where most people misunderstand silence. They think it's the finish line. They believe once they withdraw, the work is done. But silence is only the door. What matters is what you do after you walk through it. This is the second shift rising in private. In a culture obsessed with visibility, posting progress, announcing growth, proving change, quiet improvement is often mistaken for stagnation. If there's no announcement, people assume nothing is happening. The Stoics understood the opposite. Real change doesn't need witnesses. It needs discipline. It needs consistency. It needs time. The people who once disrespected you were counting on you staying the same. They needed you predictable. They relied on your emotional openness, your availability, your tendency to engage. Your reactions kept you within reach. Your explanations kept the connection alive. Predictability gave them leverage. So, what happens when you stop showing up the way they expect? When your life begins to move forward without commentary? When there's no update, no defense, no performance? Epictetus taught that everything external, status, praise, criticism even, disrespect is outside your control. What remains within your control is your inner life, your habits, your focus, your direction. When you stop trying to correct the outside world and start strengthening the inside, you step into what the Stoics called freedom. And that shift unsettles people. They may not say anything at first. They may pretend they don't notice. But they feel it. Because suddenly, you're no longer orbiting their moods or their drama. Your energy has changed. It's steadier, quieter, centered. And when that change becomes consistent, their certainty begins to fracture. At first, they tell themselves it's temporary, that you'll come back, that you'll soften, that you'll return to being accessible. But Stoic discipline isn't a phase, it's a decision. And decisions, when repeated, become identity. You're not posting about your progress. You're not clapping back. You're not responding to bait. You're building quietly, reading while others gossip, training while others complain, reflecting while others react, investing in your health, your focus, your future. This is the kind of work that doesn't get applause, but it compounds. And here's what unsettles them the most. They can't place you anymore. The version of you they knew doesn't exist. The old patterns don't work. You don't argue the same way. You don't respond on cue. Even your presence feels different, calmer, slower, more grounded. Your energy no longer reaches outward. It's anchored inward. That unpredictability is destabilizing to people who depended on your emotional consistency. When they can't predict you, they can't control the dynamic. Not because you're hiding, but because you've redirected your attention towards something that actually sustains you. This isn't about pretending you're unaffected. It's about choosing what deserves your focus. You're not ignoring them to make a point. You're healing. You're consolidating strength. You're letting the work happen where it matters most. Epictetus said, "Don't explain your philosophy, embody it." Quiet growth does exactly that. You stop defending your worth and start becoming undeniable, not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. They notice in small ways. In how you no longer flinch, in how your calm doesn't depend on their approval, in how your presence feels complete without them. Over time, they realize they lost access to a version of you they never valued, not because you made a scene, but because you made a choice. And with that realization comes something deeper. As you rise privately, the emotional pull begins to weaken. The urge to react fades. The need to engage dissolves. Because growth in silence prepares you for the next transformation, one that changes everything. When you no longer seek validation from those who disrespected you, your emotions stop being available on demand. And that's where the third move begins. As your growth continues in silence, something subtle but decisive changes inside you. You do not announce it. You do not plan it. One day, you simply notice that the words that once triggered you no longer land the same way. The tone that used to pull you into explanation now passes without friction. The behavior that once demanded a reaction barely registers. This is the moment when silence stops being temporary and becomes intentional. This is the third Stoic move, becoming emotionally unavailable. Most people misunderstand emotional unavailability. They confuse it with coldness, bitterness, or indifference. Stoicism teaches none of that. It does not ask you to feel nothing. It asks you to feel selectively, to stop granting emotional access to people who have proven they do not know how to handle it. This is what Epictetus meant by self-mastery, not controlling others, but refusing to let others control your inner state. Most people live reactively. Every opinion shifts their mood. Every comment demands a response. Every provocation feels personal. Their emotional door is always open, and anyone can walk in. That is not openness. That is vulnerability without protection. Stoicism offers another standard. You decide who has access to your inner world and under what conditions. When someone disrespects you, they usually expect a familiar script, a defensive reply, a raised voice, a long explanation. That reaction reassures them that they still matter, that they still have influence over you. When that reaction never comes, the dynamic collapses. There is nothing to push against, nothing to feed on, nothing to control. Emotional unavailability does not mean you stop caring about life. It means you stop caring about the wrong approvals. You stop seeking emotional justice from people who were never fair. You stop expecting understanding from those who never tried to understand you. Your emotions are no longer accessible on demand. You do not attend every argument you are invited to. You do not explain yourself to people who were not listening. You do not rush to clarify what was already clear, not out of spite but out of discipline. This detachment is protective, but it is also transformative. When you stop reacting, you remove the emotional cushion that allowed others to avoid responsibility. Without your anger, they cannot justify themselves. Without your pain, they cannot dismiss you. Without your engagement, the cycle ends. Epictetus taught that we are disturbed not by events, but by the meaning we give them. Emotional unavailability is the act of changing that meaning. Their words lose weight. Their opinions shrink, not because they changed, but because you did. Nothing confuses someone who mistreated you more than your calm in the face of their noise. They expected resistance. They received restraint. They expected emotion. They encountered stillness, and slowly something else happens. You feel lighter, more stable. Your peace no longer depends on how others behave. You do not need to block, announce, or explain. You simply stop offering emotional labor where it is not respected. This is not withdrawal from life. This is alignment with yourself. The people who once pulled strings in your mind can no longer do that, not because you fought them, but because you stopped responding to the strings. Your silence becomes firm. Your calm becomes consistent. Your presence becomes self-contained. And once you reach this point, something unavoidable follows. If your emotions are no longer accessible, your standards begin to show through your actions. Not through speeches, not through warnings, through behavior that no longer negotiates its worth. This is where the next shift begins, because emotional distance naturally creates boundaries that do not need to be explained. When emotional access is no longer available, your actions begin to change in quiet but unmistakable ways. You move differently, you choose differently, and people feel it long before they understand it. This is the fourth Stoic move, enforcing boundaries silently. Most people believe boundaries must be announced, explained, or defended. A conversation, a warning, a line drawn in words. Stoicism teaches something far more effective. The strongest boundaries are not spoken, they are lived. When someone disrespects you, the instinct is to clarify, to explain what hurt, to hope that if they understand, they will change. That instinct feels reasonable, even noble, but it often keeps you trapped. The people who benefit from your lack of boundaries rarely need more information. They already know. What they are testing is how much you will tolerate. Epictetus taught that your peace does not require permission. It requires a decision. Once that decision is made, words become optional. Silent boundaries do not argue. They do not justify. They do not negotiate. They simply change behavior. You stop replying to messages that leave you feeling smaller. You stop showing up where your presence is taken for granted. You stop saying yes when your body is already saying no. Nothing dramatic happens at first. Silence is often misread as distance or moodiness. But patterns reveal truth over time. Access changes. Availability shifts. The dynamic that once depended on your compliance quietly collapses. This is where discomfort begins for others. Boundaries without explanation remove leverage. There is nothing to debate, nothing to guilt trip, nothing to twist. Your actions speak clearly without emotion, without hostility. That clarity forces reality to surface. The standard has changed. Not to punish anyone, but to protect yourself. Stoicism does not teach revenge disguised as growth. Revenge keeps you tied to the past. Boundaries release you from it. Epictetus warned that revenge is a form of bondage. The moment you need someone else to feel regret, in order to feel whole, you have given them power again. Silent boundaries do not require acknowledgement to work. Some people will test them. They may reappear casually, act confused, push gently, but boundaries enforced without emotion are difficult to cross. There is no opening to exploit. As this continues, something stabilizes inside you. The energy once spent managing other people returns. Your focus sharpens. Your inner world becomes quieter and more ordered. Resentment fades because overexposure has ended. Life begins to reflect your standards back to you. Cleaner interactions, calmer relationships, fewer emotional debts. Some people drift away, others attempt to return. But by then, the distance between who you were and who you have become is clear. Not because you explained it, but because you live it. This is Stoic power in its most practical form. You do not announce your standards, you embody them. And once boundaries are fully in place, once access is truly removed, there is only one final move left. Not one of anger or confrontation, but one of completion. Because sometimes the strongest boundary is not distance, it is departure. There comes a moment when silence is no longer just strength. It becomes survival. When someone repeatedly disrespects you, tests your limits, ignores your value, and still expects your loyalty, the wisest response is no longer discussion or distance. It is departure. Not dramatic, not announced, just final. Epictetus would have called this the last act of self-respect. To disappear with dignity is not to vanish out of fear, but to leave from clarity. Most people misunderstand this step. They think leaving quietly is avoidance, weakness, or unfinished business. Stoicism draws a sharp distinction. Avoidance runs away from discomfort. Dignified withdrawal moves toward truth. You are not running from them. You are returning to yourself. The people who mistreated you often relied on your presence, your patience, your willingness to keep showing up, hoping something would change. But Stoic wisdom is uncompromising here. Continuing to give access to those who dishonor you is not compassion, it is self-neglect. At some point, silence must become your boundary, not to punish anyone, but to stop abandoning yourself. This is why disappearance is so powerful. Your absence speaks in ways words never could. While they expected another explanation, there is none. While they anticipated a reaction, there is stillness. The space where your energy once existed becomes impossible to ignore. They sit in it, they feel it, not because you wanted to hurt them, but because you stopped absorbing the hurt for them. Epictetus warned against tying peace to anything outside your control. That includes closure. That includes being understood. That includes being seen as right. When you disappear with dignity, you release the need for resolution. You stop waiting for apologies that may never come. You stop explaining pain to people who benefited from ignoring it. You no longer try to fix what you did not break. You no longer clarify what was already clear. You no longer stay where your presence is treated as optional. This kind of departure is not avoidance. It is discipline. It is choosing yourself without hostility, without bitterness, without noise. At first, they may reach out, indirectly, casually, through others. But by then, something irreversible has happened. You have outgrown the dynamic, not out of anger, but out of alignment. And eventually, if awareness comes at all, it arrives quietly. They did not lose you in an argument. They lost you in silence. And once that realization settles, the final transformation takes place. Not theirs, yours. The final stage of Stoic strength is not about what you do next. It is about who you have become. By this point, you no longer tolerate what once drained you, not because you hardened your heart, but because you refined your standards. You moved through tolerance, detachment, discipline, boundaries, and departure. What remains is inner sovereignty. At this level, disrespect no longer reaches you, not because people stop trying, but because you no longer exist in the same emotional space. You are unreachable to chaos, not cold, not distant, simply grounded. Epictetus taught that the greatest freedom is mastery of the self. And mastery looks like this. Nothing external has the authority to disturb your inner state without your consent. You no longer use silence as a tactic. Silence is simply who you are. You do not calculate responses. You do not rehearse reactions. You do not feel the need to defend your worth. Your presence alone sets the tone. People feel it even if they cannot explain it. In how you move, in how you speak, or choose not to. In how you walk away without hostility. This is not indifference. This is freedom. At this point, regret, if it comes, arrives too late. Not because you wanted it, but because growth creates distance. Distance reveals truth. Whether they understand what they lost no longer matters. Your silence was never about teaching them. It was about choosing yourself. Stoicism does not promise that others will change. It promises that you will. And that change closes doors that no longer need to be opened. You are no longer reacting. You are no longer explaining. You are no longer available for disrespect in any form. This is the final message. Not spoken, not announced, lived. From this point forward, your calm is your power. Your distance is your boundary. Your silence is your signature. You do not need the last word. You are the proof.